I'm always drawn to Ron Heifetz's definition of leadership when I think about what being a leader means. And he said it's disappointing people at a rate they can absorb.
Hello, welcome to Oxford Tea Talks. My name is Charlie Curtis. I'm an Associate Fellow and Entrepreneurship Expert here at Said Business School. I teach innovation and systems change, and I'm an entrepreneur. So I've co-founded Origin in the carbon dioxide removal space and Dry Grow that's in alternative protein.
Hello, I'm Dr. Vicki Herrington. I am the Director of Knowledge at the Australian Institute of Police Management, which is a national common police service administered by the Australian Federal Police to provide leadership development for public safety leaders across Australia and New Zealand and regionally. I'm also the Director of Academics and Research for the Global Police Innovation Exchange Leadership Programme. I'm Emeritus Head Tutor here at the Oxford Strategic Innovation Programme. And I'm also an alum of the Executive MBA here at Oxford Said Business School.
So Vicki, you run this amazing program for 12 different nations for senior leaders in their police forces to become systemic leaders and to engage in changing systems and to achieve their justice outcomes. Can you start by talking a little bit about what a systems leader is? And what systems change is, and then maybe we'll come on to the program that you run and what you're achieving with it.
So, as you know, and as we've spoken about at length, Charlie, systems change is trying to deal with the kind of reality of the complexity of the sorts of problems that we have that surround us. And policing, like many other institutions, is riddled with dealing with complex problems, whether it's looking at the fallout of social failures, which lead to increased calls for people who are in mental health crisis, which is a very acute frontline problem, or it's dealing with the resilience in the organisation to be able to deal with long, protracted emergency situations. COVID's a great example. COVID policing is a great example of that. So being a systems leader in many ways, being able to juggle that sort of multiple swirling mass of interconnected issues and problems, and also being able to create the organisation that is best postured to be able to deal with those sorts of issues as we move into the future.
So there's an element to it of the internal system within the police organisation and the complexity of that and how you lead in that complexity. And there's an element of how the police works with other parties in society to achieve its outcomes.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think actually what we're looking at when we think about systems leadership in policing is very much a mindset shift as well about the role of policing in this broader systemic architecture, which is both institutional, but it also involves business, it involves NGOs, it involves community members. So actually a mindset shift that takes us beyond that kind of slightly heroic approach to dealing with public safety to having a much broader understanding that, you know, the institutional perspective is one perspective on a problem. And, you know, we've made some progress on problems in applying that. But actually, if we're really going to be engaging in dealing with systemic problems, we need to shift that mindset or recognise that that's a mindset that's one of many. And how the leadership involved in being able to guide our organisations to engage more effectively with the other parts of the system is really where we're spending a lot more time in the leadership development work that I do.
So there is that saying that systems change begins when you first see the world through someone else's eyes. So I guess a lot of the work you're doing is on that empathy building and that perspective and helping police leaders to actually look at the world through the guise of a member of the public, through the guise of a business, through the guise of a criminal maybe, to actually understand how different people perceive that world and thus maybe explain how they're behaving and then work through that to understand how to change them.
Yeah, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there about the real importance of both the inside and the outside work that we do in preparing leaders for being engaged in systems change. So actually being able to engage in seeing the world in multiple different ways and having a suite of lenses available to you as a leader as you're trying to engage in a problem is a really important part of the internal work, that leadership development work, that reflective practice work.
So it's really interesting to hear you talk about the internal and the external. As you know, I do work with the Bridge Institute, who do amazing work in India, in the Philippines, in the UK, improving society, changing systems. And the model that we use, it's very much around, when you say internal, it's each individual understanding their own bias and then going on a journey to become more open.
Yeah.
And to become, to actually build a wider objective and to be braver, actually, as well. So the big part about finding internal courage to be able to lead in a different way, to be able to really, we talk about becoming societal leaders, to lead outside the organization. So you're actually influencing society, not just the organization you're in. Does that echo
completely
with what you do?
And actually, some of the language we use would say you need to be a post-tribal leader. So oftentimes in institutions, we think about ourselves as a tribe, right? So we have key performance indicators, metrics, cultures, ways of being, which are highly tribal. And actually, when we interact with a complex problem, we bring that tribal mindset to it. So what we're asking leaders to do when they're working across systems is to almost be post-tribal, to be able to lead beyond the boundaries of their organizations, beyond the boundaries of their institutional mindsets.
So this comes to a big problem in corporations, actually. I love the concept of post-tribal or beyond tribal. How do you bring the rest of the tribe with you? Because the rest of the tribe wants to go in one direction, and is in the corporate world, the issue is short-termist, right? It's all about delivering the short-term results.
Political world too.
You've got one leader that's thinking more about, the future and future business models. How do you bring the rest of the tribe into that post-tribal thought space?
Look, and I think it's a really, really great question, and I'm not sure I've got the perfect answer for you. What I do recognise, though, is our institutions have been set up as bureaucracies for a reason. But actually, we have to start using, the classic sort of systems change approach. You have to almost lean into the stuff that you've already got. Mm-hmm. How can we use those existing tools, tweak them, reshape them slightly in a way that actually allows us to have a much more systems mindset in the work that we do?
Fantastic. So we've talked a bit about the internal work as a leader that you need to go through to understand yourself and to change yourself and to be bold. There's then the kind of external work around the system itself and how to understand the system, where power resides in the system, how the world changes. So what the dynamics are. How do you teach that? I mean, how does that resonate with the police, and what's their role in that?
Well, I think, most professionals learn best by actually getting their hands dirty and doing things. So it's less teaching and more facilitating the learning process. But one of the mechanisms or the vehicles that we use to do this is this thing called the Global Police Challenge, which is an integral part of the GPX leadership program. We give a syndicate group, which is made up of international members across the policing world, a thorny problem, a wicked issue. This year, we're looking at things like new media, mis and disinformation, synthetic media. We're looking at crime and migration. We're looking at vulnerability and crime, or vulnerability versus crime, and we're looking at things like workforce well-being and resilience as well. And so we give them these great big topics to work with, and then they sort of spend time immersing themselves in the messy complexity of them, identifying, what the dynamics are, how things are working, what the existing solutions are or are not achieving. And then we offer them opportunities to be creative and flexible and entrepreneurial in how they feel they might be able to use their power in different ways, use their leadership, their influence to actually achieve better outcomes across any one of these topics.
And I'll come back to you and ask you about sort of what key levers do those senior police forces have to deploy to change systems. But I'll talk a bit about sort of my work with the corporate world as a sort of context for that. The corporations are protecting their broken business models, the business models of yesterday. And those businesses are deploying their lobbying money. They're deploying their marketing. They're deploying their recruitment budget. They're deploying those assets, those levers, to try and protect that business model in the past. So corporations need to, and there is great opportunity to, change the way they use those levers. So instead of all that budget being lobbying with government to maintain the status quo, actually some of that budget could be deployed to working with those groups that are trying to improve and change society, And the proposition's really great for businesses because you can influence the future of your industry. You can be one of the part of the group that is forming the future of industry. So you're going to be first to the future. So you're going to have massive competitive advantage when the future comes. The challenge is businesses aren't doing it, right? And they're not doing it, I think, for three reasons. Or I can categorize them as three reasons. There's governance, which is short-termist. There's the capacity aspect. Very few leaders have enough people to be focusing on the future alongside focusing on the present. And then there's a kind of, I call it kind of muscle memory or culture. It's very difficult to do business in a new way. So we'll just carry on doing business like we did in the last century, even though this century is so different. How is that sort of showing up for the police, and what key levers do they have that they can bring to change those systems you're talking about?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And I think the first thing is to realise that the status quo is the status quo for a reason, right? Because it's benefiting often the people in power. So you have to recognise that any time you want to change the status quo, you're automatically going to be bringing yourself in conflict with those people in power. But I think when you're thinking about how you use power, when you're particularly the work I do with senior leaders, it doesn't have to cost an awful lot of money. Oftentimes it's just changing the stories that we tell. And so I think when you're thinking about, well, how do I marry this challenge of coming up against power and with the levers that I have available, you don't have to necessarily pull very hard levers. We maybe just tell different stories. We can start telling very different stories about the value of innovation, the value of dealing with systemic problems, and the value of collaboration and collective responsibility for dealing with these issues. When you start dealing with reshaping and retooling mindsets, that's when you can have the biggest impact on the system. And that's why I think storytelling is such an important part of the role of leadership in systems thinking and systems change. Because actually, as senior leaders, we have a huge platform. And as senior leaders, the words that we use, the stories that we tell, actually have a really important impact on the cultures of our organisations and the way that we might inspire other people in the system, inside and outside the organisation, to have an impact. And so let's tell different stories.
Thank you for bringing up narrative and storytelling. And I think that's one of the key lessons of changing systems, is that nothing will change unless mindsets change at scale.
I think the biggest learning for police leaders, policing is a can-do, will-do sort of profession, as many frontline professions are. So some of the biggest learning when it comes to systems change is this is not your problem to own, and therefore it's not just your problem to solve. What you actually have to do when you're thinking about systems is recognise the other work that's going on in the space, recognise what you might be doing that supports that work, amplifies that work, or is deleterious of that work. So I think when we're talking about how we equip leaders to be able to deal with systems change, oftentimes it's about not being heroic, not launching oneself into the fray, not solving this problem with a police mindset and inadvertently causing more problems along the way.
Fantastic. So don't be a hero, and be aware of the impact of your actions beyond your intention, I guess. So some ways to do that. There's two kind of themes that are related, which are around coalition building and aligning incentives. So typically, to solve these systemic problems, you need to create non-traditional partnerships. You need to build coalitions, often with people who don't have aligned incentives. So can you talk a bit about how you deal with that, how you teach that, how you teach people to do that coalition building and to align themselves?
Yeah, and I would actually say without aligned incentives within the organisations and the institutions in and of themselves, there's very little at the moment in our police organisations that actually rewards this sort of non-heroic systems leadership work. And again, I think it all comes back to mindsets. It all comes back to understanding that the way that we view the world as a result of the institutions in which we operate, as a result of the way that we have divided up complex problems mechanistically into being able to deal with experts in police, experts in health, experts in education, recognising that may have solved or helped solve some of the problems of the past, maybe created some of the problems of the future as well. But what's gotten us here is not going to take us there. So what we need to do is recognise that the mindsets that we have had are holding us back from being able to engage in that systems work, and then being able to lean into kind of the natural human qualities of empathy, of, being able to ask interesting questions, being able to listen to what people are actually saying, rather than operating mechanistically through the lens of our institutions.
So I believe we have some questions that people have written in with. So let's ask the questions. Vicki, we haven't seen these before, so keen to see what people have asked.
All right, let's have a look. What does being a leader mean to you?
There's a one-word answer for me actually here, which is empowerment. It's opening up the space for others to be the best version of themselves. It sounds very cliched, but I think that is what a good leader does, is actually understands how to get the best out of the people that they are surrounded by.
I'm always drawn to Ron Heifetz's definition of leadership when I think about what being a leader means. And he said it's disappointing people at a rate they can absorb. And I think in many ways that speaks so brilliantly to our desire for leaders to do the direction, the protection, the sense of order, being able to keep us safe, being able to tell us what to do. But actually, I think leadership is exactly what you're talking about. It's not necessarily giving the answers, it's creating the spaces in which the answers can emerge.
Thank you. Great answers. Right, my turn. How open to what you teach are different police forces around the world, both on an organisational level and an individual level?
The thing I've been most heartened and surprised by, if I'm completely honest, is how well received the idea of systems leadership is amongst senior executives. And I think there's a number of reasons for this, but by the time you've got to senior executive levels, you've been around a while, you've seen most things, and you've tried most things. So actually being able to offer a way of reframing some of those intractable problems that we've been exposed to across our career, and then being able to kind of offer some options for moving forward on those, which doesn't mean you're asking for more money, doesn't necessarily mean that you're having to take on more work. It's about reframing your role within the system. I think actually is the reason it's become so well received across police forces. I think there's obviously a difference between those that naturally see the world as a complex adaptive system and those who maybe are more wedded to the mechanistic way of we've historically seen the world. But I'm optimistic, actually, that as we start telling different stories and we start changing the narrative, that actually more and more people become interested in the work that we're doing in systems and we start proving its worth, then, I'm encouraged by that.
And have you seen any difference between different nations, different cultures, in terms of how encouraged and enthusiastic they are?
I think all of the police forces that have, it's a self-selecting sample, right? Those police forces which have become engaged with the Global Police Innovation Exchange in and of itself are forward-leaning. They're interested in the future of policing. They recognise that the status quo is no longer serving our global public safety needs. So they're already kind of postured for wanting something new.
Remind me how senior the leaders are that you're working with.
So they're very senior. They're senior executives. So that would mean assistant commissioners, commanders, or superintendent level.
And how much time are they committing to your programme?
Well, we ask them, it's a 12-month programme, and we ask them to commit more or less 5 hours a week to private study. They also have 3 in-person connections, which are held in the Australian Institute of Police Management in Sydney, on a study tour, which last year and this year we'll be hosting in Singapore, and to a final 10-day stint, which has a couple of days here in Oxford and a week up at Tullyallen Castle, which is Police Scotland's headquarters.
So half a day a week and then 3 or 4 weeks out of their incredibly busy lives. So I'm quite inspired by the fact that they're committed enough to take that much of their time at that senior level because they believe they need this. So it's very inspiring to hear that.
And I would say, if we're looking for more inspiration, the alumni group from the first cohort that have gone through have picked up that mantle and run with it. So they're very much in their own time, are connecting globally, regularly, to be able to think through what, as an alumni group, they can do to help shape the future of the global profession.
Fantastic. So they're actually coming up with global solutions that will solve their national problems. I think it's your turn to ask a question.
My turn. So how are you inspiring change within your role or in the teaching work that you do?
Within my role, I'm quite motivated on climate and climate innovation. So I think with the ventures, with Origin in its history was doing direct air capture, carbon dioxide removal, really before there was much going on in that space. There were a few other companies that were as well. And as my co-founder Tim says, we were building something the world needed, but that nobody wanted. So I think there's something around inspiring people with what is needed in the future and what is possible. In terms of my teaching, I think it comes back to the internal. So what the OAMLP, the Oxford Advanced Management and Leadership Program, is trying to do is create the leaders the world needs. So we're trying to inspire people to really look inside themselves and really change their level of ambition to become societal leaders, to lead outside of their organization and to use these types of approaches, these types of systems leadership and systems change approaches to actually grow a more robust, more sustainable community around the organization that they work in. I think it's my turn. How is what you teach changing policing in practical terms?
This is a great question. And I think, we're still at the stage of anecdotal evidence. So the leadership program, the GPX leadership program, that really is our pilot effort into injecting systems leadership thinking into policing and public safety, was piloted for a 2-year period. So we've done 1 year and we're in the middle of the second year in which we are doing a full-scale evaluation. So I can come back in about 8 months' time and tell you exactly what the ROI is of that, because that's part of what we're trying to be able to demonstrate, because we recognise that actually if we want agencies and institutions to invest in this sort of work, we're going to have to demonstrate actually what their return on that investment is likely to be. Anecdotally speaking, I think the impact it's had on the people that have been through the programme, who are associated with the programme, is that it has inspired them to be hopeful around complex challenges. One of the things it's often easy to forget when you work in a public service institution is you do have agency to create the future. I mean, that's probably quite entrepreneurially, I think it's probably a natural mindset. We have the agency to create the future. I think you can sometimes forget that when you work in large institutions or you work in the public service. So actually being able to encourage folk to realise, no one else, we either make the future ourselves or somebody else is going to make it. But actually we do have agency to make choices about the future that we want. So I think in many ways that's the impact it's having. It's encouraging leaders to be thoughtful, creative and optimistic about the public safety futures we can create.
Vicki, it's always such a pleasure to chat to you. Thank you for your time today. Really interesting and inspiring conversation. And thank you to the audience. Thank you for joining us for this Oxford Tea Talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions, we're both pretty active on LinkedIn, so please do get in touch. And it's been great to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you.